Testing. 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 1, 2, 3. Testing.
In a fire in St. Louis.
I'm just going to start it now, and you. Well, first, just give me your and lean toward me. That's right. Give me your name.
James Lawrence Clark.
And you were telling me about some of your important records being lost.
Records that pertain to the crossing of the Atlantic Ocean some 22 times. I was involved in riding Army ships along with either one medic or a contingent of medics to take care of troops on the way to the front in Europe and to bring prisoners of war back to the United States.
You say these records that you had were lost then?
The records concerning the above were lost in a fire some years ago at the record depot in St. Louis, Missouri. See, I crossed the Atlantic 22 times, and this would be interesting to find out the dates, you know. But I know about the years, but I don't know about the dates.
Well, were they? I do have some questions here that I'm supposed to ask, so we can just go down these questions, and then anytime you want to elaborate on any of your answers, just go ahead, because this is nothing formal. But I think it's interesting what you said about your records, and it is too bad that you don't have them. First, when did you join the service?
I went into the service 10 December 1940, a year prior to Pearl Harbor.
Did you volunteer? I'm sure you did.
I volunteered.
And what branch of the service did you join, and why did you go into that particular branch?
I joined the U.S. Army Medical Department. I was interested in that particular phase of the Army, and I was sent to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. From Fort Oglethorpe, I was sent to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where I was almost immediately put to work in the hospital. Basic training came at intervals. There were times that I would have some time off. The basic training was done in those intervals. It took 4 or 5 months to get all the basic training in.
Had you had some medical training before you joined?
None whatever.
You just decided that you wanted to go into the medical corps?
That's what I wanted, yes. Mm-hmm.
And were you an officer or an enlisted person?
I was an enlisted person, from private to first sergeant. Went in as a private, and eventually on down the road, we'll get to that later, I was first sergeant, promoted to first sergeant.
And what do you remember most about leaving your home? And how old were you, and was anyone else in your family in the service at that time?
I was 22 years old at the time I entered the service, and I was a country boy, having been reared in a rural area of Lincoln County, Tennessee, worked on a farm. This was real exciting to me because I had rarely ever been over 50 miles from home before I entered the service.
Well, what happened when you first left? Did you left right from here, and where did you go then?
From Fayetteville, Tennessee. I left from Fayetteville, Tennessee, and went to Fort Oglethorpe. I remember it was in December of 1940. And I suppose one thing that I remember, of course, I was a young recruit, and I was scared of everything probably. The man that came through the barracks at night firing the coal stove probably was the most exciting thing I had for the first few days. I had to get used to that. And then after that, of course, we began some processing, and a few days later we were shipped out and sent to Fort Jackson, South Carolina.
Now, that's where you had your training then. Could you talk about the places where you trained and where you went after that? And, well, we talked about your not being anywhere in the country before that, but describe your training now. Was it realistic and helpful?
The training for the job that I was doing at Fort Jackson, South Carolina was considered on-the-job training. At that time, they were real scarce as far as medical people were concerned, and they had a hospital full of patients. And I was put to work immediately in the hospital. And this was on-the-job training Of course, I was under the direction of a nurse or doctor doing this training. I spent some 2.5 years at Fort Jackson, and then one day we received some orders. I suppose there was 12 to 15 medics from the Fort Jackson hospital were sent to Camp Butner, North Carolina. This was a brand new base. We were some of the first troops there, and the first barrack we were in was way out in the woods, and mosquitoes almost ate us up. After that, of course, I'd had the basic training at Fort Jackson, and when we got the hospital finished, this was in the process when we went there. The hospital was finished shortly after our arrival there, and then we were sent to the hospital and began work in the hospital. I was assigned to the operating room where we're doing 12 to 15 surgeries every day, and I got some very good experience under the direction of the operating room nurse.
Now, when you went in, of course, that was before the war. Who were the patients then?
Hey, see, this was before the draft actually got underway in a big fashion. People were coming into the Army all the time, and we're talking about somewhere around 1944 now. And men were being sent overseas.
1944, that was during their war. But when you first went in, though, like 1940, was before the war.
Okay, now what...
Well, I wanted to know who were the patients back in 1940.
Well, Fort Jackson, South Carolina was an old established fort, and regular Army people were already stationed there and working at the post before they started accepting draftees.
And we talked about your duties, and was that what you expected?
Yes, when I really became involved in it, it was exactly what I expected, and I liked it very much. Now, we stayed at Camp Butner some 2 years. All the time that I was there, I was working in the operating room. Then came orders for us to leave Camp Butner. We boarded a train headed north. None of us knew where we were supposed to go. A few miles after we left Virginia, the sergeant in charge opened the orders and told us we were going to New York City. And so we went to New York City and were immediately put aboard 2 enlisted men per ship. These ships were carrying supplies and troops overseas, equipment, and bringing prisoners of war or patients back to the United States.
And how long did you stay aboard the ship?
I was assigned during the 2 or 3. I served aboard 7 different ships. I have pictures of all these ships except one. Four of them, I believe, were C4s, and the others were Liberty ships.
So you were not on a hospital ship then?
No hospital ship. They're all Army transports carrying troops and equipment overseas.
And did you stay on the ship all the time then, or did you get off with the troops and go with them?
No. For 2 or 3 years, we made trips to and from the European theater of operation, taking equipment, soldiers, and supplies, and bringing patients or prisoners of war back to the United States.
Now, when you were out on the ocean, were you heavily guarded in convoys, or how would that go? We traveled in convoys, sometimes as much as 100 ships. And of course, as they say, the convoy is only as fast as the slowest ship. We had destroyer escorts around the convoy. They were our protection, and they were very busy during the trip, seeing that German U-boats didn't interfere with the convoy. Was it scary?
It was scary.
Did you have any close calls?
We actually didn't have any real close calls. On one occasion, after we'd gone into the Mediterranean Sea, headed for Naples, we had an air raid, German planes, and I've never heard so many shots being fired in my life. The air was full of well, let's see, what do they call them? Tracers. We could see where the tracers went up to shoot. As they were shooting at the airplanes. No ship in our convoy was hit, but I understand one or two German planes were shot down.
Wow. Were there people from other parts of the country in the unit that you were serving in? I'm sure there were. And how did they seem to be different from you?
Well, I suppose we had people from, during all these trips that I made back and forth, I suppose there were people on there from every state. And it was quite interesting to get to know people. Well, New York City, I'd never been in New York City before, but people in New York City were considerably different from us. I had a different background from them. I was raised in the country, and they were raised in the big city.
Did you hear any comments about having a southern accent?
Yes, I've been accused many times of being a damn rebel. But of course, during lighter times that we were talking aboard ship when there was nothing else to do, the Civil War quite often became a subject. And of course the Yankees were very boastful about having won the Civil War. Of course, we didn't figure it that way.
I bet you knew more about the Civil War than they did, though.
I'm sure I did. I had met some people, well, one boy in particular I met from New York City that had never seen a chicken. And this was rather comical. They'd never seen a cow. They had no idea where milk came from.
I'm sure you had a lot of interesting experiences like that.
Did.
Can you think of some more right now, or maybe some will come up later?
Well, aboard ship, as I said before, the occasion there are as much as 100 ships in a convoy. There were doctors in the convoy, but not a doctor on every ship. So on the small ships that I was, the freighters, we had 2 medics. I was with one other medic, and we took care of the illnesses, the medical care of all the troops and the crew. And I remember several occasions where a crew member might be cut by one reason or another while he's working on deck. And of course we had a dispensary down in the ship, and we took the patient down in the emergency room and sewed up his wound. Because we were not doctors at all, but we had some good experiences. I wouldn't take anything for the experiences of riding those ships. It was real exciting. Of course, now this is after the war. I was involved with taking displaced persons out of Europe and bringing them to the United States, South America, Australia. I had the pleasure of being on every continent except one. That was Antarctica, and this was quite exciting to me. Even today, I'd like to be able to go to Antarctica and just set foot on it to say that I've been on every continent.
Well, exactly what do you mean by displaced persons?
They were, well, for instance, Jews in Europe were people that the Germans, of course, tried to kill all of them, and they certainly didn't do it. And people that were made homeless by the war were called displaced persons, and they went to several countries, including the United States, Australia, and South America.
Was it the United States taking them to these places?
Yes.
Furnished the United States furnished the transportation and handled all their transfer.
Countries had already accepted the VPs, and it was a matter for us just to load them up and take them to the different countries.
So I'm sure you got acquainted with a lot of different languages and people and customs.
I never did learn to speak any, maybe a few words of German, But we had so many different languages, there wasn't much way in such a short period of time that I could do much learning, I suppose, of foreign languages.
What about the food for those people on the ships? Did they get any of their native type food?
The food provided for the displaced persons on the ship was food that had been initially bought for the crew members and the troops. So they got a variety of food. Now, it wouldn't necessarily be food that they'd been used to in their own countries.
Were they going to a country of their choice, or were they just taken someplace?
They were going to their country of their choice. They had a choice of going to different countries, and lots of them, all that could, came to the United States because they preferred the United States over the others. English speaking, and the standard of living, of course, was better here than most anywhere else, and a lot of them came to the United States.
Then, what do you remember most about the time that you were overseas? I guess you were on the sea most of the time, weren't you?
I was aboard ship more than I was on land. We would take 7 to 10 days from New York to Europe, and we would unload our troops, equipment, or whatever we had aboard, and within 3 or 4 days we were headed back to the United States. Our most enjoyous, pleasant, I suppose, things that we did while we were there was to go ashore and buy souvenirs and eat some of the food that we'd never eaten before. But we'd buy souvenirs and that sort of thing and come back to the ship.
Well, when you were bringing these people, were all, well, you say displaced persons, and then you were bringing prisoners back also. Were you bringing injured people?
No, the prisoners of war were not injured people. They were, all we did was take care of little small medical problems, but they were able-bodied people.
Where did you bring the prisoners of war?
Okay, we had one shipload that went to New Orleans port of embarkation in New Orleans, Newport News, Virginia, New York City, and Boston, Massachusetts. Those were the 4 ports.
And how were these people treated, these prisoners on the ship? Were they confined in any way?
The prisoners, the German prisoners, had to be confined to certain areas, otherwise it wouldn't be possible to guard them, but they were treated as well as our own people aboard ship. And of course a lot of these prisoners were hungry, and we fed them. They were proud of the food that they were able to get on ship, but they were treated very well. They were never abused in any way.
Did you get to be friendly with any of them in certain ones?
I never met a German prisoner of war that I really got to know. We weren't on board ship long enough to find out much about them. We treated a few of them on minor cuts and bruises and that sort of thing, but I did get acquainted one time with a German doctor, and I can't remember his name. He had a Polish name, but I can't remember, but he was a real nice person. I believe he went to South America, put him off in South America.
How many prisoners would you have on a ship at one time?
The Liberty ships, I believe, were equipped to carry some 1,000 to 1,500 prisoners of war. We'd take the same amount of troops over and bring the same amount of prisoners of war back to the United States. The larger ships, the C-4s, would probably carry about 3,000 prisoners of war.
Well, since you were on the ship most of the time, did you ever have any opportunity to meet civilians when you got off of the ship? Well, I'm sure you did if you had liberty and all, and what were your impressions of them?
We had a civilian crew. They were merchant marine. Now, I met several of them. One man that I have kept up with over the years is a man who lives in Cody, Wyoming, Albert Vanderpool, and his wife. He married after he got off the ship. and they have visited us. Well, they visited us here on 2 different occasions in Lewisburg. That was one friend I'd met. Another, he was a civilian, an Army person that I knew real well, Tom Dockery. He lives in New Jersey, and he's been down to see us a couple of times. Another friend in the Army from Minnesota. He and his wife and 2 children have visited us here since we got out of service. So you make friends that you keep up with, and it's a lot of fun. Just trying to think if there's any more. Merchant Marine. No, I have a Navy friend. Now the guns on the ship were manned by Navy personnel, United States Navy. I met one young man from Massachusetts, Norman E. Christian. He and I still correspond. Now he's never been able to make it out. We haven't been able to visit, but he lives in what am I think of the name? Well, Arizona. He lives in Arizona, and we correspond and talk on the phone occasionally to each other.
Did you have, well, let's see, one of the questions here, did you have any contact with any Allied troops? And I think we've been talking, of course, about prisoners, but any troops of Allied nations or what?
We would see them maybe on the dock helping unload or something like that, but we were really associated closely enough to become friends. But we saw a lot of Allied troops, yes. Mm-hmm.
And did you ever get home on leave?
Yes, between trips, we'd get home from anywhere from 3 to 7 days, and then go back to the ship and go back across again. But we had ample leave. One thing that happened when I was riding the ship was 1945. My mother passed away, and I didn't know about it for 3 months. That was the most shocking thing, I guess, that ever had happened to me. But, of course, during wartime, there's no way to send a telegram. You couldn't get in. The enemy would pick it up anyway, you know. And so they didn't even try to get in touch with me. And I got back in New York where I had lots of mail, and all the friends in Lincoln County that I'd known had written me talking about the mother. She died in 1945.
Did you get to come home then after you found out about that?
Yes, I came home for a few days, right.
When you did come home, aside from the time that you came home after your mother died, did you feel like a celebrity when you got back here, and how were you treated?
During World War II, a soldier was somewhat of a celebrity, and when you came home on leave, you were treated royally, I suppose you'd say, and of course we appreciated that because we were doing a job that we really didn't want to do, but we knew it had to be done. So yes, we enjoyed the folks back home when we came home on leave.
Were there many others of your friends that went into the service, people from right around here that you knew?
One man he was living in Pulaski at the time, Russell E. Young, who now lives in Nashville. Garland E. Lane, who was born and raised in Fayetteville, he was another one that I knew in service, and we have visited since we've been out of service. And let's see if there's anyone else. They are the only 2 that I can think of offhand that are close by, and we still visit and talk to on the phone occasionally.
Well, this is one of the questions here. It says, did you have any feelings about the people of draft age who were not in the service?
Well, that not being in the service, we call them, a lot of them draft dodgers. There was not a real good feeling toward people that were draft dodgers and tried to keep from going to war. You know, quite a few went to Canada and didn't have to serve, but there wasn't a very good feeling toward the people that were draft dodgers.
And And of course, you signed up long before the war started. But
I was in
why was
service.
it that you did that?
Well, I suppose we can go back to the volunteer state. We've lived up to the name from way on back, and I was among the first people that left Fayetteville to go into service in 1940.
Did your family approve of your leaving at that time, when there wasn't any war going on?
Yes, they were willing to let me go into service. I went in at age 22.
Well, what was going on right at that time? Did you really think that there was going to be a war?
At the time I went in, no one was really sure as to what was going to happen as far as the war was concerned, and I'd put in a year from December the 10th, 1940, till Pearl Harbor was bombed. I had a year of service, and then we had already signed release papers to get out. And of course, they scrapped they scrapped the papers, and we stayed in 4 years, 11 months, and 15 days before the thing was over.
And then, of course, you stayed on after
I
that.
stayed on in, yes,
And how long were you in?
almost 12 years. I would have stayed in for 20, but I got an injury in Korea, and I couldn't perform duty as I should, so I came out with a disability.
But you could have left, though. You didn't have to stay the 12 years.
No, I could have left any time that I wanted to. Yeah, after the war was over.
I see. And this is another question. What did you plan to do after the war was over? Of course, you stayed in.
Yes, right, I stayed
but
in.
did you have any other plans for the time when you might get out?
At the time that I was in service, I didn't think about doing anything else. I enjoyed the service. I had a lot of good times there, a lot of excitement. After I came out, as I said, I would have preferred to stay in, but then I had to get out and start looking for something to do, and that first job I had after getting out of the service was in the bookkeeping department of an oil company in Lewisburg, and I stayed there almost 10 years. The office closed and moved to Columbia, and I got out then and got into hospital and nursing home administration. I took the state exam for nursing home administrator and passed it, and I was hospital administrator and nursing home administrator in Kentucky and Tennessee.
How did the war affect you, and how did it change you, and do you think it changed the country? Of course, this was a long time ago. Now we're talking about, isn't it? 50 years almost.
Yes. How did it affect me? Well, the time that I spent in the service had certainly made me a much wiser person. When I went in, I knew very little of what was going on in the world, and when I came out, I was pretty well educated on what was going on in the world. As far as what it affected me, I don't think it had any ill effects on me other than the injury I got. As I said, I enjoyed the service, and I would have probably stayed 20 or maybe even more than 20 years if I hadn't have gotten the injury.
Or do you think it changed the country?
It changed the country from the year 1940 to 1950. During the war, this country, of course, was geared up for war, and every plant that they could find a place to build a plant, they were making supplies for the war, building planes and tanks and medical supplies and all this stuff. I think we had more women working at that time than we'd ever had before. I think that's where women first really got out into the world and proved to themselves that they could do many jobs just as good as a man could.
How was it coming back? I understand that a lot of the young men and women, too, who came from small towns, found it difficult to come back to a small town after being in the larger cities. And did you have any problem with that?
I didn't have any trouble adjusting. after I came out of service, I had come from a small town or small community, even though I had visited New York City, Boston, New Orleans, Charleston, South Carolina, and many other cities. But I think it made me appreciate the small city even more.
And you're married. I know you're. I met your wife here. And did you marry? Were you married during the time of the war? Or?
I married 1952. I was practically ready to get out of the service. Hot Springs, Arkansas, Army Navy General Hospital there. I was working there, and I married just a short while before I got out of the Army in 1952, and have been married since then. We have 3 sons, 1 adopted son, and 2 of our own. 2 of them live here in Lewisburg, and 1, our oldest son, lives in Nashville.
Now, going back to the war, the final question here: what could we have done better during the war, from your observation?
What could we have done better?
Take your time. Maybe would you like to stop it? Let's stop.
Just stop it.
Came off the top of my head, but now I forgot. Did you ever feel like there was maybe a lot of duplication in efforts that you saw on the ship?
I can't remember any.
Well, I can't think of anything either that would pertain to that.
I do know that having sailed the seas and crossed the Atlantic some 22 times, I would have very gladly stayed aboard ship and probably joined the Merchant Marine, but never did get around to doing it. But I still enjoy ship and would like to sail on. It got into my blood.
And all your trips then were on the Atlantic?
Well, after the shooting war had stopped, then we were taking these displaced persons to Australia, South America, United States. So we got into the Pacific and the Indian Ocean too in that direction.
Where were you at the time the European War ended and then the Japanese War ended? Can you remember some experiences maybe on those days that you had? How you found out?
I was at Fort Jackson, South Carolina when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And Europe, I was in service, but I was at so many different camps, I can't remember which one I was at when the European War broke out.
Mm-hmm. And what about the end of the war? VE Day and VJ Day.
I was in New York. There was a lot of excitement going on then. They'd heard some announcement that the war was going to be over, and then they would retract it. And this went on for a day or two. We were visiting in New York City, but then it came to be a reality, and there was one big party in New York City on Broad. People all over the place. The soldiers were mingling with the civilians, and everyone just having a big time.
And you were right down there in the crowd?
I was with them, enjoying every minute of it, because we were glad it's over.
What about VJ Day then? Where were you then?
What was the date on VJ?
Oh, it would have been August, sometime in August, wasn't it?
44.
45.
45.
Mm-hmm.
August of 45.
I think it's just about this. Yeah, because they just talking about dropping the bombs on Japan. I think it's toward the end of August, maybe the first part of September.
I can't remember where I was in 45. As I said, I was in so many different places. It's hard to remember dates of all of them. But I don't remember where I was in August of 1945.
Well, That's a long time back to
Yes,
remember.
it
Uh-huh. Did you have, well, you said that you couldn't get any letters about your mother or anything. What about mail? Did you receive mail all the time you were gone at certain
Yes,
times?
we were able to get mail. Sometimes it was delayed for maybe a week or something like that. But this was when we had V-mail. We'd write the letter and send it, and then it would put on a little tape, you might say, and that cut the size. That what they were trying to do was cut down the amount of things that had to be sent overseas, and this was a very small letter. Once they took a picture of it, I believe, and that made a very small letter. And we got plenty of mail, but we weren't ever short of mail, because it might, as I said, 7 to 10 days late, but that wasn't long.
Was any of it censored? Were things cut out, words cut out?
We did get a letter occasionally that would have something cut out of it, censored, which we didn't realize we were saying anything that we shouldn't, but some were censored, yes.
When would you get your mail then? When the ship would come in, like to New York or someplace?
That was a big event when you get into New York. Bags of mail would be waiting for us, and they'd go ashore and get the mail and come back and pass it out. And of course, there's a lot of excitement then. Everybody reading their letters from home, and girlfriends and wives and all this sort of thing.
What were your quarters like on the ship? The various ships you were on.
Yes, the various ships' quarters were adequate, although they were not as roomy as one would expect if you were on shore. But quarters were comfortable. Of course, we occasionally people get seasick from the rocking and rolling of the ship. I was seasick one day going out of New York, but I was never seasick again. I suppose that was enough. I'd had enough, no more seasickness. So just one day.
Tape left. What else would you like to tell me? I know there are lots of things that I'll put it in. Start back where you started to.
We were stationed in Texas, El Paso, Texas, 226 General Hospital, and we were training with that unit. They had originally thought that the unit would go overseas.
And what year was this?
This was 1946.
After the war.
But troops were being sent home every day, and it reached a point that the hospital would not be needed over there. So they disbanded us and sent us to different places. I was sent from Texas to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, where I joined an element of the 3rd Infantry Division. We were there several weeks in training, and they put the regiment on board ship, on board the train, and we went from Massachusetts to California, and that was some trip. If you've never lived till you ride a troop train from Massachusetts to California. I remember when they had a mess hall on board, and several cars. I don't remember how many, but they were all loaded with troops and gear. And they would serve a meal. They'd come through with your coffee maybe, and maybe when the meal was half through, they'd come through with the cream and sugar. And it went this way for the whole meal. The things you were supposed to get together, it might be 30 minutes or 40 minutes before you got the rest of it. But that was quite an experience traveling from Massachusetts to California on a trip. We stayed in California a few days, 2 or 3 weeks, I believe. And then we were put aboard ship and headed toward Korea. We were put off ship in Japan, southern Japan, a little town of Beppu, B-E-P-P-U. And we stayed there a couple of months, training to be ready to go over to Korea. We were there during the monsoon season, and I don't think I've ever seen as much rain fall in my life. It floods day in, day out. Of course, that was something the Japanese needed every year because it filled up their rice paddies so they could set out rice. But I've never seen so much rain. Our clothes mildewed, our shoes mildewed, everything we had practically mildewed during that time. In September, I believe, we boarded a ship for Korea. This was elements of the 3rd Infantry Division. We went to Wonsan. This town had already been blown to bits. There was not much left standing. The troops had bombarded it and had headed north. We were put ashore at Wonsan and started north. And we traveled several days. And later on, well, November, I believe it was November, we became a part of the, what they call the Chosin Reservoir. What am I trying to say? The reservoir engagement. Our most problems we had in Korea was the cold weather. Severely cold, 25 to 30 degrees below zero. Of course, we'd been in some cold climates, but nothing that exceeded that. The Chinese and Korean troops had cotton uniforms, also wore cotton shoes, and there were more casualties, I guess, among the North Korean and Chinese troops as regards to weather than we had among our own people. Equipment, such as weapons that were supposed to recoil, didn't recoil. They froze up. The M1 rifle, I saw several M1 rifles that would not work at all. They were just as if you'd welded them together, and they wouldn't work at all. But the cold weather was the biggest problem there. And in December of 1950, shortly before that, all these Chinese troops had become involved in the war there. General MacArthur didn't think that they would come across, but they did. 120,000 Chinese against 15,000 Americans. Of course, there was an awful lot of Chinese killed and wounded, and of course, our country lost an awful lot of good men there. The war itself and the cold weather that went with it. We evacuated North Korea December the 24th, 1950. Behind us, we could see the engineers blowing up buildings that they had left standing, and smokestacks. We could see them coming down. So we barely made our way out before the Chinese came in behind us. So that's sort of the end of the story.
Well, that's just about the end of
In South Carolina, I was promoted to technician 4th grade. When I was transferred, spent some time at Camp Butler, North Carolina, I was promoted to technician 3rd grade. And duty in Texas, 226 Hospital, I was promoted to sergeant 1st class. That unit disbanded, and I went to Virginia again, and I was promoted to 1st sergeant. There was a new ship about ready to leave for Europe. I was promoted to 1st sergeant to take care of a contingent of troops of 12 people. In the meantime, before the ship left, I had an emergency telegram from home that my sister had passed away. I, of course, had to come home. The orders making me 1st sergeant were rescinded, and another sergeant was promoted to 1st sergeant as the ship had to go.
We're going to talk about the kinds of ships you were on. We're talking now about the C4.
The C4 ship that I rode many times across the Atlantic was a cargo type ship, carried some 3,000 troops. The stack was aft. That means on the back end of the ship. They were faster ships than the cargo ships, the Victory ships, we call them. These were very much smaller. They carried. Just a minute. The Liberty ship was a much smaller ship than the C4. In fact, it would carry some 1,500, 2,000 troops and cargo of tanks and ammunition, vehicles, and that sort of thing. The Liberty ship was a much slower ship than the C4. The C4 was considerably faster than the Liberty, and of course carried more troops, personnel, and equipment. I served aboard 7 different ships.
Do you remember the names of the ships?
Mm-hmm. When we get through, I'll show you.
Oh.
You can hit. I've got the ships all
Oh,
except
good.
one.
All right.
Pictures of all the ships.
Oh, great.
Except
Put
one.
it on the tape.
All right.
The names.
Okay. I have pictures of all of the ships except one that I traveled on during the war and after the war. 7 in all, and I have 6 pictures of the ships which I will show.
Are you thinking now about the names?
The ships that I served aboard are as follows: the Marine Robin, the Andrew Furuseth, the Henry Groves Connor, the General C.H. Muir, the General George Howes, SS George W. Woodard, and SS Benjamin Huntington.
Well, now, tell me why. These were Navy ships, were they not? Or
They had Navy personnel, but were not Navy ships.
all right. Then why did they not use Navy personnel instead of you people on those particular ships?
I think the reason that Army personnel was used aboard the ship was because the Navy at that time didn't have enough men to man all the guns. See, they manned the guns on these ships, and they didn't have enough people to man their guns and do some other job. So they had to stick strictly to manning the guns and let someone else handle the medical personnel, the people that were sick and ill.
And that was all you did. You didn't have to do anything aboard ship or
That was it.
any duties. Oh. Well, I don't know whether you told me this, but how long would it take you to go across, say, leaving New York and going wherever you were going?
Leaving New York aboard a Liberty ship would take from 7 to 10 days from New York to Germany, and that was the name of the place where we embarked. Bremerhaven, Germany is where we went most of the time. Now on the C4 type ship, it would take less than 7 days to go from New York to Germany. The trips carrying displaced persons from Germany to South America, Australia, took approximately 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Approximately 2 weeks.
And what did you do all the time on board? You weren't always taking care of sick people.
No.
What else? What was the routine, the ship's routine?
There wasn't a lot of things that the medical people could do. Now the civilian crew members, they were merchant marine. They had jobs. They had a job that they did all the time. The Navy personnel, of course, had jobs that took up more time than our job ever did. There wasn't much for us to do when the medical end of it was taken care of. We were not doing anything. I did a lot of reading and played cards. Now, I'm not one that cares much about cards at all, but when it became so boring that I had to play cards, we'd play hearts. But other than that, the medical people didn't have much to do. We had a few records to keep and a few supplies to keep handy and that sort of thing. But our jobs did not require full-time work, so we had a lot of leisure. Of course, we got with the crew members when they were off. We'd get with crew members and talk.
Well, I keep thinking of people sleeping in hammocks. Did you sleep in hammocks, or did you have bunks, or what?
Hammocks were not used very much. You had your hammocks were more or less when you go ashore. I don't think I saw anybody sleeping in a hammock when I was on ship. We had beds that were bolted to the floor, the deck, as you should say, and they had sides on them to keep you from falling out. And during rough seas, quite often you'd get thrown out of the bed regardless of how much protection you had around you. And we've had several injuries from people that got injured by maybe falling on deck, couldn't stand up due to seas, high seas.
Because you were there it was the North Atlantic, wasn't it? And that's about the roughest part, I'm sure.
The North Atlantic, I believe, has some of the worst weather I've ever seen aboard ship. It was really rough.
You did it at all different times of the year, too.
Yes, our trips to Europe were all different times of the year. Of course, the summer and spring months were fairly calm, but winter months crossing the Atlantic and also in the North Sea were very, very harsh.
Were there any women on board, nurses?
On the C4s that I traveled on, we had a contingent of 12 medical people, and we'd have a doctor and 2 or 3 registered nurses. The Liberty ships only had 2 enlisted men. Of course, we had doctors in the convoy. If we had a problem, we could radio the convoy where they had a doctor and find out what we needed to do. But the Liberty only carried 2 medical people, enlisted men.
And the registered nurses were women?
Right.
And they were just 2 women on this whole ship full?
I believe we had 3.
People. Well, 3.
3 registered nurses and 1 doctor.
On the whole ship of about,
Right.
what, 1,000 people?
Yeah. The crew would make about 1,000 people, but of course if you're loaded, well, you had 3,000, something like that on the C4. Pretty good sized city, you might say.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, this is...
During the time that I was in the States and not riding a ship, I was stationed at several different places: New York, Newport News, New Orleans. On several occasions we had hospital trains that would pick up patients that had come from overseas. We'd say, for example, in New York City. Then we medics that had been riding the ships would take these patients to different places in the United States. One Creek, Michigan, we took one load of troops, patients to Battle Creek, Michigan, one to West Virginia, and one to Northington General Hospital in Birmingham, Alabama, or Tuscumbia, Alabama.
And this was during the war that you did this? Yeah. This was in addition to your sea duty.
These ships would bring the patients in from Europe. We'd take them off the ship in New York or whatever port we happened to be at and put them on hospital trains and take them to the different hospitals that they'd been assigned to. This was interesting work, and I enjoyed it a lot.
Sure you would. All right, if you give me your name and then your address and your telephone number.
My name, James L. Clark, 1182 Gupton, Gupton, Gupton Road, Culleoka, 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 Tennessee, 38451. Telephone number 615-359-5444. Don't look for me at this address. I live in Marshall County near Lewisburg, Tennessee, and I'm in the Lewisburg telephone directory.